right, looks like everybody's in.
All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for taking interest in Kingston's extensive history. This meeting tonight, the presentation is going to be recorded just for your own information, so you know. I'm Craig Dalton, Chairman of the Historical Commission in town. Through the courtesy of the Kingston Public Library, its Director Mike Slauson and his staff, we are hosting tonight's presentation on the Old Burying Ground Preservation Master Plan. First off, I'd like to request that you keep your microphone on mute, which should be there right now, throughout the presentation. The presentation is going to be 45 to 50 minutes long in length, and then we'll have time for questions to ask if you'd like at the end. If you have questions that you think about coming up along the way, input your questions using the chat box. Hit the chat box button at the bottom and type in your question and leave it there. And at the end, we will address the questions in the order that they're received. For a little history here, several years ago, then Selectwoman Jean Landis-Naumann approached me and the commission and asked us what we were doing about the old burying ground as it was deteriorating at a rapid pace. And although we're aware of that and we're thinking about it, that was basically the precipitant for us seeking funding from the town's Community Preservation Act fund to have a consultant undertake an exhaustive study of the historic cemetery and provide us with a step-by-step guidance and plan for its rejuvenation. We hope to get started prior to Plymouth's 400th anniversary, but our main goal was and still is to complete as much of the work as possible before Kingston's 300th anniversary in 2026. In 2018, the citizens of Kingston approved funding for the study at town meeting, CPA article there. And after the Historical Commission interviewed several really fine candidates, we selected Martha Lyon Landscape Architecture, LCC of Northampton, Mass. The plan was recently completed, and tonight the owner of the firm, Martha Lyon, will be presenting along with her associates of Fannin-Lehner Preservation Consultants, Jim and Mixie Fannin. Jim and Mixie spent many days out in our old burying ground there, surveying all the monuments, stones, and tombs. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker tonight, Ms. Martha Lyon.
Thank you, Craig. Well, it is certainly a pleasure to be here this holiday evening. We finished this project back in February of this year, and I'd intended to get together with folks from Kingston sometime around May, and as we all know, their situation's changed. So we've delayed this presentation a little bit, but I think I can speak for Jim and Minxie. It was delightful to go back and to review the plan after several months and just familiarize ourselves and remember what a wonderful experience it was working both with the Historical Commission and also just getting to know the town and its very, very long and interesting history. So much appreciated for that. As Craig said, Jim and Minxie spent a lot of time looking at the stones, and I spent a lot of time in the landscape. And I just want to mention, we had many, many, many cups of coffee at Cravings Cafe and sandwiches. Would not have done well without that lovely establishment. So we got to know the town in more ways than one, I guess I would say. Well, tonight, what we wanted to do is give you a snapshot of the plan that we prepared for the town for the old burying ground. And because we're time constrained, we're going to be giving you some of the highlights, but we thought it would be important to walk you through our process and to help you understand how we arrived at the conclusions that we did. First of all, I wanted to familiarize everyone with the idea of a preservation master plan. This is something that is very important in the process of restoring historic landscapes because they often have a lot of features in them that have particular and peculiar problems. And so the idea of coming up with a plan is to provide a step-by-step guide to managing them and preserving them over time. And the purpose is to, especially in Kingston, maintain the burying ground as an attraction to visitors, also as a resource for teaching about early American and Plymouth County history, And it's also a valued recreation spot for residents of the town, and particularly folks who live in the neighborhood around the burying ground. So essentially what we're doing in the plan is, one, we're trying to understand what is historically significant in this burying ground and why. We are also trying to understand what all of the problems are facing the burying ground. We understand what problems are the greatest, and then we achieve to understand how to solve the problems. That's a very basic skeleton of why we do this. I can just reiterate what Craig said. We had some terrific partners on this project. One of the things that Jim and Mixie and I really like to do is to get to know our clients and spend a lot of time in the community. We worked closely with the Historical Commission members. They are all listed here, and I know some have joined us tonight, which is great. Thank you. We also need to just send another sincere thanks to the Public Library and the archivists for helping us dig up all of the historical information we were able to get, including a lot of old maps, which were just so important to help us get together a base of information for proceeding with our work. And then, of course, the team. I am a registered landscape architect, and I served as the project manager. Jim and Mingxi Fannin are professional stone conservators and preservationists, and as Craig mentioned, they really concentrated on the monuments and the markers. And then finally, we engaged John Watney, our colleague, who is a structural engineer based in Salem, to look at the tombs. And you'll know more about the tombs in just a second, so just be patient with that. Before we started working on the project, we met with the commission, and we asked them to come up with kind of a wish list of items that they wanted to be sure that we addressed in the plan. And this is what they were. They were concerned about parking. This is not a burying ground that has a parking lot in it, and shouldn't. But that said, people need to get to it. And so finding a way to accommodate parking nearby, very important. Also, there is no entrance to the burying ground off of Main Street. Main Street is where the first church is, and it's not really easily possible to get into the burying ground from that side, and coincidentally, that is where parking is available. Also, there are no accessible walkways in the burying ground to speak of, and the terrain, which I'll talk about in a minute, is not even. So for folks who have any type of physical disability, navigation can be difficult. So looking at try to create some kind of a walkway system that will at least get people in. There's a lot of concern about the trees and the burying ground, and I know if you are all familiar with this property, it's really become a forest, which has its lovely features to it. And I'll tell you, being out there one day when it was in the 90s, it felt great to have some shade. But the trees are in need of care. There are many trees that really need to be removed. And I think the commission was concerned that there must be a way we could refashion these trees to better complement the landscape. There are no interpretive signs in the burying ground. In fact, there are really no signs at all. So if you're coming here and you're not familiar with Kingston, it's not an easy place to find or to understand what's important about it. And then finally, there was a lot of interest in creating a map that could be linked to a grave database. So long-term, visitors from far and wide could perhaps access that information through the internet, plan a trip to Kingston and come and be able to locate a grave that they were interested in. So here's just a very brief outline of our process. We developed the program, as I said. We determined a period of significance, which I'll talk about in a second. We prepare a base map. We assess everything that is in the cemetery, all of the features. We develop recommendations and cost estimates, and that leads us to a final plan. And so right now, we are kind of at this stage right here, from the final plan, beginning to think about implementation. One of the first things that we do And one of the most important things that we do is to begin by looking at what the history of this property is, how it was established and changed physically over time. The reason why this is important is because when we're thinking about how to preserve, we need to understand what periods in history need to be represented. The cemeteries often have a very long history in the sense that, in this case, established in the 18th century and active up into the 20th century.
Oh, your grandfather just,
If someone, people could just make sure they mute themselves, that would be great. So we're trying to establish what is the period that this cemetery represents, and then from there we can understand how we go about preserving it. But just briefly, I'm sure a lot of you are.
Do you know how to turn off your camera?
People could just mute themselves. That would be great. Thank you. We know that Kingston began as the North Precinct of Plymouth. As early as 1840, folks were living here. They came up from Plymouth. And by 1716, there were 48 families living here in this area, in the Kingston area. But up until about 1716, 1717, it's likely that most of the interment took place in Plymouth at one of the established burying grounds. In 1717, Kingston established a separate.
how about stop video?
Stop, Dylan.
Janice,
Ah!
if you could please mute yourself, that would be great. Thank you. Plymouth established a separate precinct status and give them a license to construct their first meeting house, which was in 1718 and in 1719. And the image on the right, on the top here, is a sketch that was made of that structure. It's no longer there, it has been replaced, but as you can see, if you're looking at the front of it, you're standing on Main Street, and it was a long, it had a long facade across Main Street. In 1720, John Bradford, who was a descendant of the early governor, gifted 2 acres to be reserved for the meeting house, a training field, and the burying ground. And so these are the parts of the burying ground that today stand closest to Main Street. And we all know that the training ground is still in existence as well. It is adjacent to the cemetery. We also know that there was an early highway that ran behind the meeting house that was a feature at some point in the burying ground. And that also the stone walls that we see there today that still stand were likely constructed as early as 1788. So there's some historic features right there. In the mid-19th century to early 20th century, the burying ground went through a number of changes. One is that a second meeting house was built in 1798, and that stood on the property until the 1840s, excuse me, the 1850s. But there were also other things that happened here. One is that more land was added. There was 1 acre and 45 rods added to the north side, and a part of this was used as a pauper's lot, which is a lot for disadvantaged folks who have lesser means and cannot necessarily afford their own burial site and marker. We also know that the 5 private tombs that are built into the north slope, still standing today, were built early in the 1800s. The townhouse, we know, a very prominent historic structure in Kingston, was built along the east side of the cemetery, the burying ground, in 1841. And another 1/4 acre was added to the northwest side in 1926, and that's the area where today stands the veterans' grave site. Another really significant thing that happened in the early 1900s was that there was a trust fund established in memory of Lucy Prince Ames, and it was set up specifically for the care of the burying ground and its monuments. And this ended up having quite a significant impact on the property because there were funds available to take care of it. So we know by the 1920s, there was some writing about the burying ground, and it was considered a place of beauty with a simple and suitable planting of hedge and evergreen trees. Beginning in 1930 and then up into the present, the property went through what I would call periods of modernization and then decline. Modernization in that in the 1950s, the veterans area that we know today, land that was added to the burying ground in 1926, was developed. And when that was developed, the asphalt road we see that cuts down through the burying ground from Green Street put this very modern feature right down the middle or the side, leading to the veterans area, which is an area that's filled with veterans graves with flush markers. So this is a very contemporary feature in a burying ground that dates to the early 1700s. The other thing that happened later in the 20th century is that Kingston became the official owner of the burying ground, and then in 2002, the property received National Register status. So the property became overgrown, it had some new features put in it, but yet there was a beginning to think about why this is so important. It's important to the history of Kingston, and it's an important place to preserve. And I think after the National Register came along, the Historical Commission really started to think about, boy, we really better start paying attention to this very important property. And as Craig mentioned, they've taken that on. So we define the period of significance for this property. So it's a period that best reflects when the property reached its highest degree of integrity, historical integrity, being 1717, when we believe it was established, and the first interment took place, to the late 1950s, when that modern veterans area was added. During this period, as I said, first interment, land was gifted for the burying ground officially. More land was added, the tombs, the stone wall, the cast iron fencing and gates that are there, family plots added. And then, as I mentioned, the half acre for the paupers' graves. So let's talk a little bit about the landscape conditions today. And I'm going to go through this in a very abbreviated way because I wanted to leave some time for Jim and Minxie to talk about the gravestones and monuments, which I think are of great importance to the town, and they should be because they're very valuable. When we look at landscape conditions, as I mentioned in the beginning of this, we look at everything that is really in existence on this property. So we're not just looking at natural features like trees or ground covers. We're looking at constructed features like the fences, fences, like the walls, like the tombs. We're also looking at functional features like how do people get around? What are the views in and out, etc. So this is just a drawing here, a map of the burying ground, and you can see there are notations made on it that indicate different features. So in this case, we have views, and we can see that the black arrows are pointing to views that we consider to be a little less pleasing, and then the grayish shaded arrows are ones that are very pleasing and could be enhanced. And there's many opportunities to enhance, and then also areas where we might want some screening. As I mentioned, most of the visitors that enter come in through the east gate, which is right at the north of the town hall, the townhouse. This is private property now. There is an easement that leads into the burying ground to a gate that is here. But this is a private parking area, so parking is not permitted here. So while people can access on foot, they can't leave their cars. So that gives reason to think about going over here to look at how we might enter, and there's opportunities there to do that. And as I mentioned earlier, there aren't any other pathways in the burying ground, and the terrain is somewhat uneven. The trees, as I said, are great concern. There are 74 deciduous and evergreen trees growing in this very small property, which is just under 3 acres. The vast majority of these are evergreen trees. The species Thuya, which is cedar, and Picea, which is spruce. And they're a dominant species, 40% of Thuya and 32% of Picea. This is a problem because this is approaching what we would call a monoculture. And what that means is that there are 1 or 2 species that just are so dominant. If something were to happen to them, like get a disease, they could all get wiped out and it would radically change the look of this property. So anytime you're thinking about tree health in a landscape like this, you need to think about diversity of tree species. Also, a lot of the trees have reached full maturity, and also their health really varies. Several trees are what I would call high quality specimen trees, which is wonderful. So just to summarize, there are several what I would consider character conflicting features, so things that conflict with a historic character, one being the asphalt road. There's chain link fencing along the west side, and these masses of evergreen trees, which are really quite unruly and overgrown. And then there are a few features that also are missing. And one of those would be the long views across the landscape that were once in existence that are largely obstructed today by the masses of trees. And then this historic road that we know existed at one time, there is no reference to that anymore. But there are also a number of highly historic character defining features. And these include the perimeter walls, the cast iron fencing and gates here and over here on the south side, the tombs, which are located up in this area here, the specimen trees I mentioned. There's several family plot enclosures, and then finally the gravestones and monuments. And I'm going to turn this over now to Jim, who's going to give you an overview of the condition of those features.
Thank you, Martha. Good evening. We enjoyed, as Martha said, being in the old burying ground and in Kingston itself. Our favorite break place at that time was the public library, although it was hard to stay away from the puzzle table when we went in. As part of the preservation plan team, our task was to do a condition assessment of all the gravestones and monuments in the old burying ground. Next slide. Now, what is a gravestone and monument assessment? Well, the purpose is to determine all the gravestones and monuments that require conservation treatments. By making this determination, estimates of the cost of conservation can be developed. The stones are listed on a form, an assessment form, and a priority of repair, either 1 or 2, is assigned to the stone. Next slide. Here you see a page from the assessment that was done. And it says on the left column, grid number. This is so if somebody wanted to find the stone, they might have a chance to do so with a map, at least. Identifying name, last name, first name, a date of death, the type of stone, headstone, footstone. We looked at all the footstones too, so that they were all looked at. And there's obelisks, monuments sometimes, some places. The material is what it's constructed of. The majority are slate, because of the age of the cemetery. The next line is, the next section is treatment. And this is best as we can determine without digging the stone up and doing a full examination. And then under notes, we say what problem the stone is having, so you will know what what to expect when you see it. And the last is the priority, which I mentioned, 1 or 2. These are all urgent priorities. So every gravestone and monument is examined closely to determine its condition. And here's the sheets I said that you get from that effort recorded. The old burying ground has a wide range of stone types and materials. The prevalent stone, as I said, is slate due to the age of the burying ground, slate being the earliest type of gravestone material that was used in New England. But there are a good number of marble stones and some granites. Now, when examining a stone, we look for stability, tilt, losses, cracks, delamination, which you see here, and I'll mention in a minute, previous repair, whether it's been successful or not, fragments, inclusions in the stone of like slate has things in it that aren't really slate, ferrous or iron in a stone, which can be very bad for it, breaks, bases, concrete skirts or puddles, which is where the stone is basically a hole dug in the ground, then concrete put in and the stone stuck in it. Flaking, erosion, and sugar decay, which is a term used for the marbles that are gradually fading away due to the acid environment. When the examination is completed, a tentative conservation plan is decided for the stone, and that's what you see under the treatment section here. Let's look at some of the conservation challenges. Next slide, sir. Here's one you've seen, and this is a slate stone. As you can see, the top is opening up, and that's what we refer to as delamination. This one had a cap put on it to try to prevent it from allowing water into the middle of the stone, which in our climate is not good for it at all. Unfortunately, it looks like they didn't stabilize the delamination before they capped it, so it just kept opening up, and the capping is not doing the job for which it was put there. Okay, this is, we found this several places. These are headstones, just or stones rubbing together, which may not look too serious, but these are fairly soft stones, and over time, with the frost moving them up and down, either one, the other, or both of them are going to suffer some damage, and therefore the simple solution is to move them apart so that doesn't happen. Next slide. This is common to what we find in the old burying ground. Slates that are broken. This one has a repair, and we'll need the repair what we need to be removed so it can be repaired once again. But there are numbers of broken stones in the yard which are going to take a good deal of conservation effort to put to right. Next slide. This is a sunken stone, as you can see. It appears that we could tell that it's whole, but it certainly is low in the ground. We had to dig out to try to get the date of death. And as you can see on the upper right side of the stone, there is a major delamination going on, which, if allowed to continue, the face of the stone will fall off and you'll have a blank stone. So these are the kind of things that need to be addressed. Next one, Martha. Yes, biological growth. Kingston has very clean air. There's no question. You can see how happy the lichen are growing on your stones. In the big city, we don't have that problem because the air quality isn't good enough for lichen to survive. But there are a number of stones here, and you have some very beautiful stones that really should be cleaned in order for people to be able to see the kind of high quality carving that's been done in the old burying ground. Next stone. Oh, these are marbles. This is a marble monument, you can see, which is heading down. We always say it's easier to put it back up before it falls and breaks than it is to put it back together after it's down. So this is a serious problem in the old burying ground, not only with this stone, but with many other ones. The next one. Here's a small monument that's fallen. The pins have been dislodged. And again, this is a case where it needs to be excavated and cleaned and reassembled, pinned together properly. So it'll stand for a good long time. Next stone. This is a marble headstone, is a good example of a number of stones in the old burying ground. We probed a great deal, but could not find a base. The most likely process to get it vertical again, if we've no base available from the old base that we could be reused, is to cast one in concrete with a slot that's larger than the stone slightly. You bury the base in the ground just below grade, and you mortar the stone in with a high lime, which is a fairly soft but holds it very well, mortar, and then landscape over it with sod in order to hide the fact that you have a concrete base holding up this nice marble. The next stone is similar. Again, it may need a new base, but this one has broken from falling. And the conservation process for something like this is you clean it and do a blind pinning. You drill holes up and down and pin it using an adhesive in order to join the two fragments together and have it standing again. In our assessment, the numbers, as you can see, about 650 stones. We have about 117 pages of like the one you saw there in our assessment. About 330, which is 50% of these, are tilted. So there's a great deal of work to do just to reset stones so they avoid them falling. 110, about 16% are broken, and about 14% or 93 are delaminated, which is a fairly high number of delaminations, which is indicative of the kind of slate that was available at the time to the carvers. I mean, they didn't have a lot of choices. It had to be from nearby. They had no way to ship it long distances. And the remaining 20% have a whole variety of other problems, including just lying on the ground, not broken and just out of the ground. So here's what I meant when I said a chance to find the stone. Here's a grid that ties into our assessment so that you can at least get pretty close to where the stone is standing that you're looking for. So that about this number of gravestones, 660, is a sizable number. And that's, we think, to divide the work up into sections, because there's nobody, I think, in our business who will settle in and do 660 stones at one time. And also it makes it easier funding to work it in sections. And later on in Martha's presentation, she presents a plan with 10 phases of stone conservation projects, which I think looks very good. Thanks a lot for listening to this dissertation on assessing condition of gravestones and monuments in the old burying ground. And now I'm going to turn it over to Minxie, who is going to talk about some of the carvers, known carvers who carved the beautiful stones that you find in the old burying ground. Minxie.
Thank you, and hi, everybody. Examples of skillfully executed gravestone carving abound in Kingston's old burying ground, but that isn't just my opinion. Eminent gravestone carver scholar James Blackowitz devotes an entire chapter entitled A Neighboring Tradition, the Kingston Carvers. And this is in his 2-volume work on gravestone carving traditions in Eastern Massachusetts. Well worth hunting up in the library. In this brief talk, I will show images and give a bit of background on some of the 14 carvers represented in the old burying ground. Where's that?
Next. There you go.
Yeah. Old burying ground contains gravestones that exemplify, in both iconography and materials, the changing view of death in American society due to the skills of well-known gravestone cutters whose work is displayed in the old burying ground. We can follow this evolution. The earliest slate stones in the late 17th and early 18th centuries depict the winged skull. Here we see the 1733 headstone for Mr. Joseph Holmes. It was carved by Nathaniel Fuller of nearby Plimpton.
Next slide.
In the works of the well-known Sewell family of carvers, we see a transition between the winged skull and face. Characteristic of this prolific family, which were based in Worcester, and their stones are all over New England, are the embroidered hair, the oval eyes, small mouth, and elaborate border. Further into the 18th century,
Next slide.
the design of the stone softened into a winged angel or face. We have a couple of examples of this type. The 1757 Mrs. Anna Warren gravestone was carved by William Codner, the successful Boston carver. His cherubs are recognizable by, quote, a full, chubby face with an attached cap of curls.
Next slide.
Then we come to Kingston's own renowned carver, Bildad Washburn, who managed to transition through the above styles as well as looking forward to the classic revival. Above you see Mrs. Esther Sampson, a 1782 stone in the early winged skull tradition.
Next slide.
And here we see Mr. Washburn's stone for Mr. William Rand, Reverend Mr. William Rand from 1779. And here you see the winged face. Finally, we see this talented carver, next
slide,
transition to perhaps his most beautiful phase, his unique rendition of the classic urn and willow that was so popular in the early 19th century. The 1824 Mrs. Mary Delano is one of a number of these magnificent stones built at Washburn in the old burying ground. The urn and willow motif also signaled the gradual shift in materials from slate to marble. You see in the old burying ground many fine examples of the gravestone cutter's skills in marble. Go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Oops. Sorry. For instance, here is a great, what we call affectionately, a finger pointer executed by Kingston's Harris Thompson, which is even signed.
Next slide.
While gravestone carving is not a requirement of the Preservation Master Plan, it is a particular interest of ours. We think it's important that communities are aware of the treasures in their cemeteries and burial grounds. And I hope you'll all get out and take a really close look at the wonderful stones in your community. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxie. Thank you, Jim. That was great. And I agree, encourage everyone to get out and take a look, even though it's becoming winter. It's a nice time to go because there isn't as much shade in the burying ground. Okay, so now we come to the recommendations. So this is the culmination of all the work, all of the studying we did of this property and the research. This is the roadmap of how we want to bring this burying ground back to, just a much more enhanced state. So we defined 9 different projects that could be taken on little by little over time. They're not in any order of priority, largely because funding for these projects can come from many sources, and sometimes there might be a source that comes along that would be perfect for, in this case, doing some work on the trees. So you would take that on as the funding came along. But nevertheless, they're all listed here, and I think the town just needs to decide how they want to approach this. Starting anywhere is fine. So the first project deals with the trees. This would involve doing a thorough tree health of the burying ground, looking at what the conditions are, confirming the species, what the conditions are, making recommendations for removing and treating, removing trees and trees that are in an advanced state of decline, and then pruning the lower limbs up 15 feet or so that the views get opened up into the burying ground and some more light can get into the ground, into the landscape itself. The second project involves restoring the east entrance. Now, as I mentioned, this is not a place that you can bring a car to and leave. So the idea here would be to enhance this so you're preserving its character, but to make it really a pedestrian entrance. And this would involve removing the existing gate that is there and other metalwork and restoring those members, cleaning and writing the granite posts, and then resetting on the town property, because right now some of these features are not officially on town property. The third project is our attempt to try to bring some accessible route into the burying ground so that, as I mentioned earlier, persons of all different levels of physical ability can get in and take a look. And also it reactivates those entrances that are off Main Street. So in this image, obviously the church, here is Main Street here. There are 2 breaks in the existing fence, and also existing curbing that's along here that are natural locations for entry points into the burying ground. And in this case, what we would do is we would introduce a 4-foot wide path that would skirt along the backside of the church and allow folks to get in and then open up those long views across the landscape. And this area right here that I'm pointing to would be a great location for benches and or interpretive signage. So it would help people understand what's important about the property and orient them to the most prominent graves. This project would also involve cleaning the old stone walls and restoring some of the cast iron fencing that exists along by the church. The fourth project is a bit of a bold effort, but I think this is a great opportunity for the town to think about not just closing this burying ground down, but actually making it available for more interments. This is the veterans area right now. It encompasses what's inside this red rectangle, or I should say polygon. And what this project would do would be to open up the area that was never developed on that small little 1/4 acre of land and extend this area for more cremation burials, moving the flagpole, and then also utilizing that asphalt roseway as possible other location for more cremations along either side of it. The roadway would be removed and narrowed and a walking path retained, but alongside the edges of the road, more cremation burials could be added. And then of course, enhancing the screen between the burying ground and the adjacent property. This would provide about 100 more cremation sites. The fifth project involves stabilizing the tombs. Now, John, our engineer, looked at these. He went inside them and he assessed the condition of them. And while there are some problems with them, they are stable. They've been there for over 200 years, and it's not likely they're going to collapse anytime soon. So the right approach to this is to think about just stabilizing them further, filling cracks, repointing joints, possibly waterproofing the roofs, and then one of the tomb doors is missing and that needs to be restored. The sixth project is what Jim alluded to in his presentation. This is dealing with the gravestones and markers in the tomb markers. We divided the work up into 10 different efforts. And the reason for this is that, as you can see in each one of these efforts, we're talking about restoring anywhere between 40 something and 80 something stones. The reason for this is that it's hard to take on a very large stone restoration project at one time, a conservation project at one time. So by taking care of this in small sections, it allows a conservator to work, over several seasons to get the work done in manageable chunks. And then also just budgeting for this is a lot more manageable because we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars all at once to conserve these. The seventh project is also a bit of a bold move. I have to credit Craig Dalton for this, and we'll call it the Craig Dalton Memorial Entrance. He pushed us to think about thinking of adding another entrance to the burying ground along the north side. So this is the entrance to the Evergreen Cemetery. And what this project would do is it would allow visitors to come in, create a couple of free parking spaces, and then a meandering, gentle pathway that would lead up the north slope into the expanded Veterans Burial Area. The length of this pathway is necessary to traverse this steep slope so that it would be compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. The eighth project involves restoring these family plot enclosures, and there are several of these. These are very distinctive. They enclose plots of families of graves, and a lot of them are intact, but they've become askew. And so this would involve straightening these, possibly putting a little bit better base underneath them, and then in instances where there are granite posts that mark the corners of these, cleaning and straightening those. And then the final project involves creating a sign program. As I mentioned in my early presentation, there is really no way of, there's no marker that marks the burying ground except for the cast iron gate on the east side that is in need of repair. So visitors have a bit of a difficult time finding it if they're going along the street. And also, this is a great opportunity to not only welcome people and explain what the rules and regulations are for visits, but also to provide some interpretive information and possibly a map. This is a program that was established in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. If you go and visit the city, they have 4 at least old burying grounds, and each one of them is marked by a sign like this. So those are our 9 projects. As I mentioned, can be done in any order. And then finally, we always end our projects with a management plan. As you might imagine, kind of like owning a house or a car, it's one thing to build it or buy it, and it's another thing to keep it in good condition. And this applies to a landscape as well. So here are some tips about how to make that happen. First of all, we're recommending that an official management structure be established for the burying ground. Right now, the management of it is a little bit in limbo. This could be in the form of a cemetery commission or a friends group, but an entity that can oversee the management, the maintenance, the conservation work, and the programming that's associated with the burying ground over the long term. Second of all, it's very important to keep a log of any kind of repairs that are done. So not only the stones, which absolutely need to be documented if they're conserved, but any other work that's done, such as removing trees, pruning trees, planting trees, maintaining the walls, maintaining the fencing. All of that should be recorded in one place that's kept in a secure location. Also, regularly inspecting and caring for the trees. One of the reasons for that is aesthetic, but the other is that you probably have many times seen what happens in the big storm in a burying ground with trees that haven't been cared for in a long time. And you see these big limbs come down, and they can do significant damage to these very valuable old stones. And we really want to try to keep that from happening. Fourth is whenever turf is removed for any reason, to encourage the growth of ground covers rather than turf. Ground covers minimize the need for mowing, and mowing can cause stress on the stones. Clearing growth from structures and yearly inspecting in time for signs of deterioration. It's a very simple method of just watching for decay. And then finally, and I think really importantly, is seeking professional advice whenever there's a question. And I can't stress this enough with the stones themselves or the tombs. These are very, very old, very valuable, not replaceable artifacts. And even though this is outdoors, it really is like a museum with rare specimens in it. And it needs to be treated properly by professionals. And just finally, you probably all know, a well-maintained landscape will help prevent vandalism. So we wanted to thank you for inviting us to come and do this. It was absolutely our pleasure. And I believe that there's some time left, about 10 minutes or so, for any questions that we'd be happy to answer if people have them.
And if people do have questions, you can go ahead and put them over on the chat box there and address them as they come in. Ken had a question about the fund, Lucy Ames Trust Fund there. That's the fund that was established, and there was, it's held by the treasurer, the town treasurer, and any expenses out of that are approved by the selectmen, or the selectmen, board of selectmen here in town. Recently, the Historical Commission has requested some emergency funding for emergency repairs on a couple of graves that are out there now. So that basically is, I think there's like $40,000 there at the moment, or close to it. And it's not enough for a big project, but it is a good thing to keep in there for any emergency uses in the future. So we try to avoid that, and any future funding we look for other projects that were in this plan are hopefully coming from grants and other outside sources, not from that fund. So that was one question that was in there. I think it was the only one that was in there, and I don't see the others right now. But, they come up, we'll have a few minutes, but that was great. I'd like to thank you, Martha, and Jim and Nancy coming on there. That was very interesting tonight. So I guess, Mike, I think you see any other questions on there?
Looks like we just got one more.
I have a question.
James mentioned that 660 stones are in need of repair. How many stones are there total in the cemetery?
Good question, right?
We never counted the whole place.
Really, we have no idea, because our job was to document the stones that need work. So we didn't really need a total number. It'd be interesting to know. We'd be interested.
Yeah, that's actually probably a number that our archivist here could get. So Ted, if you send me an email or send the library an email, we can find that out for you.
Tom Vendetti might have an idea on that. He's
Well,
our expert.
there are over 1,900 burials there as of 1859, and a few more after that time. So I would say there's probably a little over 2,000 burials. That doesn't mean 2,000 stones,
Right.
of course.
Right.
And but as far as we know, that's all. Yeah.
I think there was someone on voice who had a question as well.
Yes, I had a question. I'm Pat Thompson. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, in about 2004, I was discovering some family information about my husband's family, the McLaughlins, and went over and, was researching the ancestors of John McLaughlin, who lived in Duxbury, but was buried back there on the old burial ground. And I did notice there were a lot of lichens, and I wondered, I'm getting a little older now, but I was wondering at the time, it's like, how could some people help to take some of what's a safe way that you were proposing to take the lichens from the stones?
I'd like to kind of address that if I could. I'm not an expert on that, and many people aren't, but we have had a couple conservators out there doing work on the stones, and it's a delicate business. And one of the things that she was suggesting is, and after post-COVID here, we hope to, there are some simple things that people can do if they're trained in it. The Historical Commission was hoping to have some sessions with the conservator to give some a trained group instructions, or possibly doing some light cleaning on some of the stones there. But it would be under, when it happened, it would be like on a weekend thing when we'd be out there, and the conservator would train us all on just what we'd be doing. Wouldn't be any major stuff, but some of the light stuff could be done by volunteers like that. But we really try to avoid people going in there with scrapers and whatever, because the stones, as they've said, are very fragile.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But that's something we can keep your name on file there, and let you know when that training comes up.
Okay, and how do we keep up with this process so that we hear what's happening and keep up with what's being done?
How did you hear about this?
We drove by the library the other night, and there was a sign out.
Thanks, Mike. That's very
Hey,
good.
the sign
Yeah,
works.
it does. That's good. That's one thing that we'll be doing, and we will have stuff in the paper about it. Hopefully, we'll be using our little webpage and the town site more and more as well.
But we're in Duxbury, so we wouldn't see it, would we?
You could access the town's website and look
Okay.
into the Historical Commission there too.
Okay.
But you can drop us an email, or Mike an email, and we will. Our email is khc@kingstonmass.org, and we will keep you on file for any information about the cemetery.
Okay. Would you just repeat that, please?
Sure, it's KHC. That's the Kingston Historical Commission. KHC
KHC.
at Kingston Mass.
And Kingston, Mass.
.org.
Yeah.
And actually, Mike put his up on his. He put it on the chat line too.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, welcome. Any other questions tonight then? If not, I want to thank you all for attending tonight, and most of you stayed all the way through this, which is very good. For your information too, there's a full copy of the plan available now, thanks to the work of Susan April, the town archivist at the library there in the local history room. She has got the entire plan online now so that you can access it, including all the maps and plots there. So that's something you might want to take a look at your leisure, including the 117 pages of assessment reports that the Fannins made there. They're all in there as well. So hope you have a safe and happy holiday season. And once again, thank you very much for attending tonight.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Let me just add real quick that if you know someone that wanted to watch this program but couldn't attend, this program is being recorded, so it'll be up on the Kingston Library's YouTube channel tomorrow. And if you just search Kingston Public Library in YouTube, and that'll come up. And if anyone's interested in local history, we have a really unique local history collection here in Kingston. So either email me, which my email is in the chat, or give us a call, and we can help you out.
And I just want to also invite anyone who is listening tonight who would like to come for a tour of the old burying ground. I've done several of them. I'd be very happy to locate graves for you, help you out. You can contact Craig through the Kingston Historical Commission, and I'll get in contact with you and figure out where your ancestors are buried if I can. And we can do that sometime. Social distancing, masks on.
Okay. I'm just putting up our email on the chat board as well, so that if you want to get us, you can. All right. Well, thanks again, people, for the presentation
Thank
and for
you.
attending.
And thank you for inviting us. It was our pleasure.
Okay. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Happy holidays.